Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today it's time for those about to rank. I'm going to be re-ranking the studio albums of ACDC from worst to best. For longtime subscribers of the channel, you might remember that when I was first starting out, one of the first videos I ever did was counting down the studio albums of ACDC here, so my order has changed since then, so I thought it'd be fun to revisit this here today and re-rank the studio albums of the band. And just for the record, I won't be including any Australian releases here, just focusing on the core 16 international releases. Also, no compilation albums like Who Made Who, no live records either, just the core 16 international studio albums. So, that said, let's get started here with my number 16. In ranking the studio albums of a band like ACDC, it's really hard to pick a worst album in their catalog because, to be honest, I don't think they have a bad album, and I enjoy just about everything ACDC have done, so really tough here, but one album has to be the last, one album has to be my number 16 here. So that said, the de facto worst album, I guess, has got to be Blow Up Your Video from 1988. Still a very fun, solid album with some standouts that include Heat Seeker, That's the Way I Want to Rock and Roll, Mean Streak, Nick of Time, Rough Stuff, Two's Up, and This Means War. So there are some fun, interesting tracks on here in my opinion, but overall I recognize that it's not quite on the level of some of their earlier 80s material, and I think that Malcolm Young really struggling with alcoholism at this point may have hampered the creative process of this record. Brian Johnson also pretty burnt out as a lyricist here. This would be the final album in which Brian Johnson would be the main lyricist for the band, and Simon Wright would depart the group shortly after this album's release. I believe he did the tour for this record, but then departed the band shortly after that, and would be replaced by Chris Slade in the future. So, this album, not great stuff here, compared to some of their earlier 80s material, but still a lot of fun, and I enjoy it. But again, something has to be last, so that said, coming in at number 16, I'm going to go with 1988's Blow Up Your Video. Again, the bottom of this list is really difficult to put together because this whole ranking is really close together as far as I'm concerned, but some albums are just going to have to be ranked lower than others. So that said, for my number 15 here, we have 2000 Stiff Upper Lip. Really fun, great rockin' album here by ACDC with some blues elements as well. I love the cover here of the statue of Angus, the bronze Angus is really cool. And looking at the track listing here, I do enjoy tracks like the title track, Meltdown. House of Jazz is a great underrated deep cut here in the ACDC catalog that a lot of people dislike, but I'm not really sure why. I think it's really fun. You got Hold Me Back, Safe in New York City, right? Can't Stop Rock and Roll, Satellite Blues, Give It Up to close things out. There's some really strong material on here, and even though it's down towards the bottom of the list, that's just because, look at the greatness of the AC/DC catalog. Some things just have to be ranked lower than others, but in my opinion, this is a really, really strong album, and, I enjoy it, right? Some very solid stuff here. The first release of the 21st Century by AC/DC. Gotta go with Stiff Upper Lip here. Another fun, great rockin' album. Coming in at number 14 here, we have 1985's Fly on the Wall. This is really an album I think should be ranked a lot higher on the list, but what really sinks it for me is the production on here. Produced by Angus and Malcolm Young. The sound just sounds really muddled on this record and really does sink it for me and make it, gravitate towards the bottom of the list. But I think, the live material here off this album is a lot stronger and really did translate much better to a live audience. I think the Fly on the Wall tour is fantastic. The band were really tight. It was just a great, no thrills, fantastic hard rock show right down to business, and the band were on fire at that point in a live setting. But in the studio, the production for this album is subpar in my opinion, but there are some really enjoyable tracks like Fly on the Wall, Shake Your Foundations, Danger, Sink to Pink, Stand Up, Hell or High Water, Back in Business, and Send for the Man. So, I do really dig it, but the production just kind of sucks here on this record, which is why it's so low on the list. At number 14, I gotta go with 1985's Fly on the Wall. Much better live. After the release of Stiff Upper Lip, AC/DC made us wait 8 years for another studio album. So that said, coming in at number 13 here, we have 2008's Black Ice. This album has about 15 tracks on it, which, some people thought that's too long of a record, right? There's some filler on here, but for me, I think, well, if the band made us wait 8 years, there better be a ton of tracks on here, and they absolutely delivered in that respect. A lot of really fun tracks on here from 21st Century AC/DC, like Rock and Roll Train, to be a classic here from this record and a live staple ever since. Got Skies on Fire, Big Jack is a ton of fun, Anything Goes, War Machine, Super Heavy, love that song, probably my favorite off of the record, right? You got Smash and Grab, Spoilin' for a Fight, Wheels, Decibel, Stormy Mayday, She Likes Rock and Roll. I mean, every song on here is really enjoyable in its own way, even though there probably is some filler on this album. I'm able to look past it because every song is fun and a great listen. Some other standouts here include Money Made, Rock and Roll Dream, Rocking All the Way, and then Black Ice, the title track. Another great song here to close out this album. From top to bottom, it's stacked, right? Some great modern-day AC/DC material on here that I think is a really fun listen, and, I really dig it. The final with Malcolm Young on guitar, as he would not appear on their next studio album, Rock or Bust, as he would shortly be diagnosed with dementia after the release of this album. He tore Black Ice, but, that tour, he really struggled to get through it, and he'd be practicing his parts, well before the show would begin, which is something that he never did before, according to Angus Young. So there definitely was something up with Malcolm, and of course dementia would be the problem there, and he would no longer be a part of the band, a part of their touring lineup or their studio lineup after the release here and the tour of Black Ice. But nonetheless, some great stuff here, and I think a really solid way for Malcolm to go out in the studio. Strong album here, coming in at number 13 from 2008. I gotta go with Black Ice. After the disastrous Rock or Bust tour, it left a lot of AC/DC fans wondering, will there ever be another AC/DC album back to the way things were? But in 2020, AC/DC bounced back in a major way with my number 12 on the list, Power Up. It's a great reunion, comeback, whatever you want to call it, album here. Brian Johnson returning to the band alongside Cliff Williams and Phil Rudd as well, right? Some great riffs on this album, right? Some great vocals by Brian Johnson as well. Awesome to hear the band back, in a much better state this time than they were during the Rock or Bust tour, which I'll talk about that in a little bit. But, Power Up, a lot of fun to listen to. Got some great, rockin' tracks on here. Realize is an awesome album opener. Rejection, Shot in the Dark, modern-day AC/DC classic in my opinion. Through the Mists of Time, very out of character for the band, but I dig it nonetheless. Got Kick You When You're Down, another unorthodox AC/DC song. Witch's Spell, Demon Fire, No Man's Land's got an awesome riff, Money Shot, and Code Red. Just some more fun AC/DC here. It's their most recent album, and it might be their last. I'd love it if AC/DC surprised us all with another studio album. I'm not sure what they're doing right now, but if they were recording another album, that would be sick. But, I'm not betting on it, so in all likelihood, this is the final AC/DC album, and a really solid way to go out. A great reunion, comeback album here after the disastrous Rock or Bust tour. So for my number 12 here, I got to go with Power Up from 2020. For my number 11, let's go with one of the first albums that I ever owned, and that's 2014's Rock or Bust. Consider this, my unpopular opinion for the video, but I actually prefer Rock or Bust to Power Up, which came out several years later. But nonetheless here, they're both really strong albums, but I just kind of enjoy this album a lot more, and there might be a bit of a sentimental effect to it here because, again, this was one of the first albums I ever owned. Right around the time when I was getting into AC/DC, they dropped a new album. I was very excited, and you got some great songs on here like Rock or Bust, Play Ball, Rock the Blues Away, Misadventure, Dogs of War is so heavy. I love that song. Got some Rock and Roll Thunder, Baptism by Fire, and Mission Control to close things out. Just a really strong, short album, yes, but some really enjoyable material on here, in my opinion. And, of course, the tour, like I've been alluding to, was a mess. Brian Johnson had to, leave the tour and depart from the band for a period of time due to his hearing loss, and was replaced by Axl Rose of Guns N' Roses. Phil Rudd, also unable to tour this album due to a ton of legal issues he was having at the time, replaced by Chris Slade. And Cliff Williams would retire as well after the tour here due to, I believe he cited vertigo as his reason, but I'm sure a lot of that had to do with the part that the band was just not itself at this point. You kind of had Angus Young manning the ship on his own, being the glue kind of trying to hold everything together, even though the band was falling apart left and right. And, for me, I saw them live with Axl Rose, and, I think any other fan may have really enjoyed that show. But for me, AC/DC were my favorite band at the time, and I was not a huge GNR fan yet, so, for me, seeing Axl Rose fronting the band, it left a bad taste in my mouth, and it really did turn me off to AC/DC for a number of years. And it wasn't until I rediscovered the Bon Scott stuff and the release of Power Up that really did draw me back in as an AC/DC fan. But that's the tour. The album itself is fantastic in my opinion, and I really enjoy it. Concise, right to the point, and another great rockin' album by the band. So for my number 11 here, we have 2014's Rock or Bust. We move on now into the top 10, and for my number 10, I'm going to go with 1996's Ballbreaker, the first album marking the return of Phil Rudd to the band, who had departed the group following the recording of Flick of the Switch. He's making his return here a little over a decade later, and this is, in my opinion, one of the heaviest AC/DC albums out there, and I think a lot of that does have to do in part to the fact that it was produced by Rick Rubin, and Rick Rubin had previously worked with metal bands like Danzig and Metallica, so definitely with his production here, it was a heavier edge to this album, in my opinion. But there are some really great standouts here, like Hard as a Rock, Cover You in Oil, The Fuhrer, Boogeyman, Burnin' Alive, Hail Caesar, Whiskey on the Rocks, and then Ballbreaker to close things out. Just a great, heavy album here by ACDC in 1996. A fitting follow-up to Razor's Edge from 1990. Just really, really strong in my opinion, and super enjoyable. So kicking us off in the top 10, I gotta go with Ballbreaker from 1996. Next to number 9, we have another one of the first albums that I ever owned. That's For Those About to Rock from 1981, the follow-up to Back in Black. And I think this album immediately had a disadvantage, seeing that it had to follow up the monster release that was Back in Black, a career-cementing album. So, I think For Those About to Rock will always kind of be in the shadow of Back in Black, but I really dig it. Of course, yeah, For Those About to Rock, We Salute You, the title track, which is a classic, is a live staple as well for the end of their shows. But looking at the rest of this album, it's all comprised of deep cuts that were either played on this tour or never performed at all, So I love some of the deep material on here, like I Put the Finger on You, Let's Get It Up, Inject the Venom, Snowballed, Evil Walks is fantastic, COD, Breaking the Rules, Night of the Long Knives, one of my favorite AC/DC deep cuts, and then Spellbound to close things out. Produced by Mutt Lange, it's great stuff here. Brian's vocal performance is fantastic. It rivals his work on Back in Black, I think, from a vocal perspective. Just great stuff here, and, of course, the tour was more of, AC/DC promoting Back in Black. That was their monster release at the time. Even though they did release a new album, it seemed like Back in Black was the main focus, and for that reason, I think AC/DC's, releases from the early 80s kind of always live in the shadow of Back in Black, including this album here, For Those About to Rock, which is nonetheless a very strong album comprised of a lot of great deep cuts. But coming in at number 9 here, I'm going to go with Those About to Rock from 1981. Another one of the first albums I ever owned. Another really strong release here from the Brian Johnson era, following up Back in Black. After a few mundane albums in the 80s here that saw AC/DC's quality dip just a little bit, they made their massive mainstream return here with Razor's Edge from 1990. An incredible album that sees the band returning to their former glory here. Got Chris Slade making his debut on the drums, and, I'd like to show my copy here signed by Brian Johnson, personalized as well, to John, keep rockin', Brian Johnson, AC/DC. One of my favorite items in my collection. Really happy to have it signed by Brian. Just great, great stuff here on this album, with some standouts being Thunderstruck, Fire Your Guns, Money Talks, The Razor's Edge, Mistress for Christmas is fun, Are You Ready, you got Shot of Love, Goodbye and Good Riddance to Bad Luck, and then If You Dare to close things out. Produced by Bruce Fairbairn, it's a great album, and, a great return to form for the band, I think. So, coming in at number 8 here, gotta go with the classic from 1990, Razor's Edge, and my signed copy. For my number 7 now, let's go with Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap from 1976. Great Bon Scott era album here. You got Dirty Deeds, the title track, Love at First Feel, Big Balls, Rocker, Problem Child. There's going to be some rockin'. Ain't No Fun Waiting Around to Be a Millionaire is a really underrated track in my opinion. Ride On and Squealer. Ride On, in my opinion, is one of the best Bon Scott songs ever, right? I think, when you look at the quintessential Bon Scott song, a lot of people will say it's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll, but for me, I'd say Ride On. Just an absolute classic. Great, great stuff here by the band, especially Bon on lead vocals does a killer job. But, I think when it comes to, Dirty Deeds, honestly, the better version has got to be the Australian release of Dirty Deeds here, which, once you listen to this one, you can't go back to the international. But for the sake of this video here, I'm only counting down the international releases. So, chances are if I was just doing, every album and including the Australian one, this would be a lot higher up on the list, in my opinion, probably in the top 5 somewhere. But today, focusing only on the international releases of the band. So coming in at number 7, I got to go with Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap from 1976, the international version, which, number 7, still pretty high up on my list, but again, the Australian version, I think, is much better. For my number 6, from 1976, we have the international debut of AC/DC with High Voltage. This, of course, combining Australian TNT and Australian High Voltage here into one album, taking the best of both of those records. And again, we're talking only international releases here, so this is a great international debut, in my opinion, right? It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll, which is just a drop-dead classic and, one of those quintessential Bond-era tracks. Rock and Roll Singer, The Jack, Live Wire, TNT, Can I Sit Next to You Girl, Little Lover, and High Voltage to close things out. I mean, every song on here would become a live staple for the band's 1970s set list, right? Some great, great material on here to kick off their international careers. An incredible debut here in High Voltage from 1976, my number 6 on the countdown. Breaking into the top 5 here, and my number 5 has got to be Flick of the Switch from 1983, turning 40 years old this year, and, this is one of those AC/DC albums that is criminally disrespected by by a lot of fans, overlooked in their catalog, and severely underrated as far as I'm concerned. I mean, just a super heavy album, got some great riffs here. Brian's vocals are fantastic as well. It's the final with Phil Rudd on the drums until Ballbreaker from 1996, and he goes out in style here with just a killer album in my opinion. Really heavy stuff like Rising Power, This House is on Fire, Flick of the Switch, Nervous Shakedown, Landslide, Guns for Hire, Deep in the Hole, Bedlam in Belgium, Badlands, and that awesome guitar riff, and Brain Shake to close things out. Produced by ACDC, it's killer stuff here. Every song on here is an absolute banger in my opinion, and you know, I've said before on the channel that I prefer the Bon Scott era to the Brian Johnson era, even though both eras are great, but this, in my opinion, is the second best album of the Brian Johnson era, and you know, still to this day, I think it's aged really well. A fantastic record here that gets severely overlooked by a lot of people, but it's one of my favorites in the AC/DC catalog, so I had to put it in the top 5. Turning 40 this year from 1983, I gotta go with Flick of the Switch here. Just a great overlooked album in my opinion. Coming in at number 4 here, let's go with the mighty Powerage from 1978. This is one of the more underrated Bon Scott era albums, I think, seeing that a lot of the tracks on here are deep cuts and lesser played material, like Rock and Roll Damnation, Down Payment Blues, Gimme a Bullet, What's Next to the Moon, Gone Shootin', Up to My Neck and You, and Kicked in the Teeth. Of course, there are 2, you know, live staples, better known songs on here like Sin City and Riff Raff, but just in general here, I think a pretty overlooked album from the Bon era. You can see the band here on the back. It's the first to feature Cliff Williams on the bass, replacing Mark Evans, and it's also the first AC/DC album, or I should say the first international AC/DC album to not feature a title track, which I think is pretty interesting as well. Just great stuff here from the Bon Scott era, and one of the more overlooked albums from that era in my opinion, so I definitely wanted to give it some recognition here and put it in the top 5, because for me, I absolutely love it to death. There's not a bad song on here, and you know, every song on here is an absolute banger, so for my number 4, I gotta go with Powerage from 1978. This is where it gets almost impossible, in my opinion, right? My top 3 here. But, you know, the way I'm feeling today, and this order could change a little bit depending on the day, but the way I'm feeling right now, coming in at number 3, we're going to go with the classic Let There Be Rock. A great album from top to bottom, really. I mean, Go Down, Dog Eat Dog, Let There Be Rock, Bad Boy Boogie, Problem Child, Overdose, Hell Ain't a Bad Place to Be, and Whole Lotta Rosie. This might be the most stacked AC/DC album from the Bon Scott era. I mean, every song on here is a classic, in my opinion. I love that album cover as well. Just absolutely sick stuff on here. Really cool shot of Angus on the back. An amazing album from top to bottom, and, you know, definitely belongs in the top 3, in my opinion. I'd love to rank it higher, but, I mean, when you have a catalog the caliber of AC/DC, there are 2 that are stronger. Coming in at number 2, let's go with 1979's Highway to Hell, the final AC/DC album in the lifetime of Bon Scott, who unfortunately would pass away in early 1980. But what a way to go out here for Bon, on lead vocals here for one of the best rock albums of all time, in my opinion. I mean, 1979 was a loaded year for rock and metal music, so really hard to pick the best album from that year, but Highway to Hell has got to be right up there, in my opinion. Another perfect album from top to bottom. The title track is fantastic. Girls Got Rhythm, Walk All Over You, Touch Too Much, Beating Around the Bush, Shot Down in Flames, Get It Hot, If You Want Blood, You've Got It, Love Hungry Man, then Night Prowler, a great bluesy song to close things out with an awesome guitar solo by Angus. You know, and I think one thing that was really missing from the Brian Johnson era after Brian took over as lead vocalist was, you know, more of a bluesy element that some of the Bon Scott songs had, including Night Prowler here to close out Highway to Hell. One of my favorite AC/DC songs, a killer album closer to one of my all-time favorite albums here, but, you know, again, when you have the caliber of a discography like AC/DC, there is one album that I think is stronger from the Brian Johnson era, so surprise, let's get to it. And finally, coming in at number 1 here, to the surprise of no one, I gotta go with Back in Black, in my opinion, the best AC/DC album of all time, and I mean, it's really hard to dispute that, with tracks on here like Hell's Bells, Shoot to Thrill, What Do You Do for Money, Honey, Giving the Dog a Bone, Let Me Put My Love Into You, Back in Black, You Shook Me All Night Long, Have a Drink on Me, Shake a Leg, Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution. I mean, every song on here is essential AC/DC, and there's a reason why at least 50% of this album is played on classic rock radio on a regular basis, because it's such a timeless album. First with Brian Johnson on lead vocals after the death of Bon Scott earlier in the year, but I mean, Brian Johnson comes in, takes the reins here, does a fantastic job on his first studio effort with AC/DC. Got some great lyrics on here, some killer riffs written by Angus and Malcolm Young, and some, you know, really great vocals by Brian Johnson as well. I'd say this is the peak of Brian's vocal abilities melodies here on this album. The band give this record their all, and it's their most successful album to date, and probably their most best known as well, for good reason. You know, every song on here, like I said, is absolutely essential in the AC/DC catalog, and this is another one of the first albums I ever owned. Even though I love the Bon Scott stuff just a little bit more, it's hard to deny that the best album they ever made was from the Brian Johnson era, and it's Back in Black, the ultimate comeback album here from 1980 following the death of Bon Scott. The first to feature Brian Johnson on lead vocals, formerly of Geordie, comes in, does a killer job here. Just great stuff from top to bottom. So that said, my number one on the list has got to be 1980's Back in Black. So that wraps up for those about to rank, counting down the AC/DC International studio albums from worst to best, which should be visible right over here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you never miss a new upload, and let me know down in the comments below what's your favorite AC/DC album. I'd be very interested in hearing your picks, so let me know all that good stuff down in the comments below. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.